last 4 years as a freelance consultant, I've interviewed probably nearly 150 people, vicars, church wardens, project managers, fundraisers, architects and members of congregations who've developed and created perhaps some of the most innovative and creative community building projects within our parish churches, involving major reorderings, introduction of new furniture and facilities, provision of community space for a whole range of community activities and providing premises for a range of community services. As we heard yesterday, the two main drivers behind why churches decide they want to make changes to their building are usually either to meet modern worship needs and or to enable the building to be used for a wider range of community activities. Basically, if churches are going to survive, then they must become relevant to their 21st century congregations and communities. And this is much the thinking behind the Church of England's recent report that we were talking about yesterday, which looks at the future of the management of their 16,000 plus parish churches. Some reorderings have little or no effect on the historic fabric. This is the farmers' market at St Giles Shipboard. Those boards are put up on Thursdays and they can be taken away and have no permanent effect. This is another one you've probably all heard about, the community shop and post office at St Leonard's Yarpole, and obviously that has had major intrusion into the west end of the church, but again has been very successful in a small village. But where they're successful is usually where they're able to be both imaginative and sensitive to the building in which they are located. And also a key factor in success is that they have hopefully provided a secure future for the building, which is in some cases now being used 7 days a week instead of just 1 day in 7. But the important bit is that it's reconnected that building with its wider community. When I talk to people who've made these projects happen, I usually ask them not just about their original vision and what they have achieved, but also about the challenges they've faced in actually undertaking it and the lessons they've learned. There's no denying that these are complex projects. It's about developing a church and community building project within a historic structure. And that brings with it not only the usual issues raised when adapting a historic building, but additional sensitivity, because these are buildings which many view as sacred places, and they are also greatly loved by their local communities, even if they hardly step inside the door. And on top of this, there's the matter of managing a huge budget where the funds are probably coming from many different sources. That was a summing up from one church warden I came across, which she wrote in front of the celebratory book when they launched the project. So these projects require huge amounts of time, energy, tenacity, and at times sheer determined stubbornness. For the majority of people I speak to, this is the first time they've undertaken this particular journey. And so when I ask them about the particular challenges they've faced, the same 6, which are up here, are usually identified time and time again. However, as I've only got 15 minutes, I'm going to concentrate on 2 of them. The one at the top, managing concerns and opposition, and the third one, dealing with the authorities. Overall, much of the tension that can and very often does arise during the development of these projects comes from the different perspectives with which all of those involved view the church building. And by all, I mean 3 main groups. There's the clergy, the PCC and the congregation. There are the authorities, by which I mean the DACs, Historic England and the amenity societies. And thirdly, there's the local community. These different viewpoints, with their varying emphasis on the heritage, mission and outreach, can and do produce conflicts of interest, which it can prove on lots of occasions very difficult and painful to resolve. We have to remember that the care and upkeep of a heritage building is not the primary reason why people join a church. And over the last few years, a lot of work has been done to make congregations feel more positively towards their buildings. The rising wave of imaginative adaptations of church buildings for community use, to quote the Church of England report, is proof that churches in the main are no longer seen as a burden, but in fact a potential tool for mission and outreach. Most churches appreciate that if they're proposing change, they must consult with their local community. The parish church is there for everyone in the parish, and it is important to ensure that what is being proposed is answering a real need, is relevant, and is generally understood. Most churches I speak to try very hard to get this right. Questionnaires are pushed to every door, asking people for suggestions on what they would like to see the church used for. There are open days and meetings held to discuss draft proposals. Regular updates provided through newsletters, websites, and public displays of plans and drawings are organised. But while managing the responses was relatively straightforward for some churches, it does become a major challenge for others. And along with many positive responses, there are those who express genuine concerns and in a very few cases downright hostility. We don't care if we are the last generation that uses this church. We don't want your changes, was one response the church received. And in any small community, any form of opposition can be painful. It can result in letters to local newspapers, petitions handed in at the vicarage door. And in one case I came across very recently, the MP, who happened to be Theresa May, which might be pretty scary, and the county Lord Lieutenant were both called in and came to visit. Sometimes the opposition can come from a large group within the community. Sometimes it can come down to one or two people. Several vicars talk about waiting until a certain individual passes on so we can finish the job. In most cases, negotiated compromise saves the day, although in a few cases, as we heard yesterday, it does come down to a consistory court. Some of the concerns come from a fear of change. Experiencing change can bring up a lot of very complex emotions. It's about leaving things behind and taking a risk on the future. What else might it lead to? And some of the difficulty, I think, comes from, if you're not used to looking at plans, of actually people being able to visualise what it will look like. Churches can try and help by producing 3D drawings, like this one, which shows very clearly where the toilet's going to be and the kitchen and what have you. Others have used slightly more bizarre ways of visualising the possible future. In fact, it is very unlikely that Charlie's Angels will be appearing in the church. The actual outcome is usually more like this. But it's also important here is the difficulty of managing how the reordered building will feel. Will the special spiritual feeling have been lost or changed? And this is a very personal thing that can differ within the same congregation. At a very basic level, a lot of it is about what it means to be a church and what people expect to see in a church. They don't think they've been to church unless they've sat on a pew, was one remark made by one church warden. However, the other church warden in the very same church explained how she has gone along with removing the pews because she realised that it was for the good of the church. But she said that for her, it doesn't feel church anymore, and for me, some of the mystery has been lost. This church, a Grade 2 star church, was proposing a fairly radical reordering of their church and undertook a very detailed consultation. And they produced an equally detailed report which recorded yes and no responses. And as you can see there, I don't know if you can see at the back, the responses and comments made by regular church members were differentiated from those made from within the wider parish. There was a degree of opposition to all proposals and significant opposition from church members, but even more so from members of the wider community when it came to specific areas such as the addition of a kitchen and facilities, the relocation of the organ, and also questions about what sort of activities could take place in the church. It proved the truism that quite often those in the community who never come to church are those that get the most upset. This slide shows the responses to the question raising the possibility of taking out the pews and replacing with a more flexible seating system, i.e. chairs. This question gained the largest number of no's, and the largest, 112, came from the wider community. Many of the comments added underneath this question revealed, again, that many saw that the pews were essential to the traditional spiritual feel of the church, and there was a general anxiety over losing the particular atmosphere of the building. As someone said, its essential characteristic tranquility should not be sacrificed. Some did, however, say they appreciated that chairs would make the church more adaptable for different activities, while another person accused the PCC of trying to turn the church into an entertainment centre and a cafe. So how do you respond? Many church wardens and incumbents said that they listened and by acknowledging that there were genuine concerns, were better able to openly engage in discussion. Not responding in the local press was one good piece of advice, as it can escalate before you know where you are, but holding open public meetings and inviting people to come and hear about what is really planned and why it is vital, as this is about keeping the channels of communication open. Some organised trips to other churches where projects have been completed, or invited speakers from those churches to come and talk at a public meeting. But one of the best pieces of advice I heard from a vicar who said, make sure that everyone in your church and those involved in the project are all, as far as possible, on side and is telling the same story. Ensure that everyone, from the incumbent, the church wardens, the flower arrangers, the people that do the teas at the coffee morning, is able to say what is happening clearly and simply. We are putting in toilets and a kitchen so that more groups can come in and use the church, and we're going to be opening the church every Saturday during June and July. It is the mixed messages and stories that start rumours. The church is going to be turned into Babington courts. Some said that despite opposition, they had to take a decision, even if at times it felt a lonely one. As they said, they were the ones faced with large repair bills and a declining congregation, wondering if the church would survive if more people were not invited to make use of it. Some, in the light of concerns, do amend their original proposals, some acknowledging that it produced a better result. This is the church whose consultation questionnaire I showed you, and that's what it looked like in the top left before anything happened. So they put all their pews in storage in a local barn while the new underfloor heating on the floor was being laid, with the intention of putting all the pews back. That had been the express view that came out of the consultation, that all the pews should go back. Oh, that's gone too far. But in the period between the new floor being laid and the pews being collected, which was about 2 weeks, people came into the church to look. And they suddenly realised what a wonderful space had been created and what a different but still spiritual feel it had. So they asked the vicar if somehow the space could be retained. So in the end, only 12 pews were put back, and the west end, as you can see in the bottom left, is now clear for community space. In other cases, in my view, it can end up as a rather unsatisfactory compromise. In this Grade 1 church, which I mentioned earlier, where both church wardens felt very differently about the pews, it was decided that they would only take the pews out of the nave, but leave them in the aisles. And most of them now would say that they have created a more uplifting worship space and a flexible space, in that they are now facing each other and not looking at the backs of each other's heads during services. However, the pews in the aisles have just become the stacking area for the unused chairs. The vicar have said that they are now, or still, disappointed that the original vision was curtailed, and they are intending to go back to the parish in due course to see if the remaining pews can be removed. So in this respect, I would stress the importance of building a relationship with a wider community. I have, for instance, recently come across 2 very evangelical churches whose congregations come from a much wider area than just the immediate community, but who also are able to raise large amounts of money without needing to apply for public or lottery or trust monies. And so they have neglected to talk to their local communities. Plans have come to light, and strong opposition has been formed by those who see that their parish church is being changed and taken away from them. I should also add that it isn't always about the pews. Many churches arrive at very satisfactory solutions while keeping the pews. This is a Grade 1 church, and here they were able to use the base of their tower for the facilities, which you can see bottom right. They actually wanted to keep their pews because they see it as a way of making people feel close to each other. And a member of the congregation, who happened to work for British Leyland, designed pew trolleys, which you can see in the bottom left, which means that the pews are now angled so that everyone can see the altar more easily. And they can also be moved right out of the church when they hold banquets, barn dances and parties in the pews events. So just to move on to the second challenge, dealing with the authorities. The other big issue for PCCs is that they still, very many of them, find it irksome that there are all these other organisations which have the right to get involved and place restrictions on any of their proposed changes. The authorities, by which I mean Historic England, DACs, amenity societies, are still, in many quarters, viewed as inhibitors of change, and there is still spoken dread and fear at the approach of Historic England and perhaps the Victorian Society. I continually come across tension between a church and these bodies. This is obviously not surprising that it tends to sadly be always the Victorian Society that gets the most flack, largely because, as we know, major reordering projects at the moment involve the removal of 16th century furnishings and fittings. However, what I find depressing is the perception seems to be that the Victorian Society automatically always says no. I came across a church warden again recently who said that the main problem in getting his fellow PCC members to even discuss the need for a toilet was the express fear that this will mean we will have to get those English heritage people in, and that means trouble. And I have also come across at least a couple of churches still incandescent with rage because of the fact that the VICSOC stopped them making all the changes they wanted, even though discussions did mean that they were able to make, in my view, the majority of their proposed alterations, but they've never forgotten they were not allowed to do whatever it was. So how do we get PCCs and congregations to understand that heritage is not necessarily a barrier to making constructive and positive and sensitive changes, and that it can be a matter of engaging in constructive discussions? Sometimes it is because they're not aware of the significance of what they're looking after. Many have said how much they learnt about their building and how much more pride they had in it after they have done their statement of significance, especially if they've received help in that process. So giving parishes training in how to work through the completion of a statement of significance and statement of need can go a long way in helping them to understand their building, and from there help inform discussions on what can we agree is worth dying in the ditch over, and what, in the spirit of trying to achieve our respective objectives, can we agree can be changed or moved. Many, however, do appreciate the advice which helps unlock previously insoluble problems and also lessens the impact of the changes on the historic fabric. And I've heard lots of praise from parish churches who say they helped us find the right solution, much better than the one that we had been discussing, and one that minimised impact. They also explained why, so that we understood why it was not in the best interest of the heritage of the building to remove the font or put the toilets in the chapel or whatever it was. The other advice is, as we all know, is encouraging churches to consult with Historic England and the amenity societies as early as possible, and to consult with the latter at the same time as the DAC. The VICSOC says very often they are consulted way down the line when projects have already become fixed in people's minds, and to also give people like the VICSOC the same documentation as is required by the DAC. It can also be about encouraging clergy to think about how the heritage that surrounds them can also enhance worship. The beauty of the stained glass windows, as well as showing the continuity of the building as a place of worship for generations, can be very powerful, and maybe we have to find ways of articulating this better. Only recently I was at a workshop where a vicar started off by saying that his church had several large monuments that were in the way. Once we had established the fact that they weren't physically in the way, but actually they were in the way of his vision of a clear-lined, beautifully open church, it was actually another vicar who pointed out that the monuments could be seen as symbols of the continuity, and should be seen as physical representations of some of the previous generations who had worshipped there. Thanks.